Have you ever wondered why the punishments handed out in the old American West were so brutal that even modern movies shy away from showing them? Some of the punishments you're about to remember were so unsettling they'd never make it past a Hollywood script meeting. Let's start with one you rarely see accurately portrayed: the punishment called riding the rail. You might think you know what that means. Maybe your mind goes straight to someone being dragged out of town or tossed from a train. But no. In the West, this was something far more physical, far more painful, and far more humiliating. You picture a long wooden fence rail, thick, heavy, unpolished. Now imagine being forced to sit on it, but not sideways. You're straddling it like a horse, and the rail is not smooth. It's rough, splintered, sun-dried timber. You can almost feel the biting wood cutting into the inseam of your legs as you think about it. The townfolk didn't stop there. They'd often place heavy weights in your hands or tie buckets of sand to your feet. That's what made your thighs shake and your spine lock up in pain. This wasn't done in a corner. You were paraded slowly down the main street where everyone could watch. Kids pointing, old-timers shaking their heads, people whispering your name like it was already ruined. The context was simple. Frontier towns didn't have functional jails, and they didn't waste bullets on petty offenses. So if you insulted someone, cheated at cards, picked the wrong fight, or flirted with the wrong rancher's wife, this is what met you. Compare that to today, where for a misdemeanor you might get a fine or maybe a court date. Can you imagine a world where your neighbors drag you outside and balance you on a splintered rail just to teach you a lesson? And as you picture that, ask yourself, could you have kept your dignity if the whole town stared at you shaking on that beam? Another punishment that movies always flatten into something simple was branding. Not cattle branding, human branding. You remember the iron? Heavy, blackened, glowing orange from the fire, and the sound it made when it hissed against flesh. But what you probably don't remember is how deeply emotional that punishment was for the person receiving it. Because branding wasn't just pain, it was a permanent mark, a stain on your story. Imagine being labeled a thief for life, not metaphorically, literally. Burned into your skin, you feel your stomach tighten just thinking about it. The context behind this was harsh but practical. In isolated territories where people moved constantly and identities were easy to change, a brand was the only record that followed you everywhere. Try to start over in another town, someone catches a glimpse of that mark on your shoulder or your forearm, and suddenly you're not a stranger, you're a criminal. Today you'd fight your case in court or expunge a record. Back then, you carried the heat of one mistake with you until your last breath. And it makes you wonder, how different would your life be if every bad decision you ever made stayed visible on your skin? And there was staking out, one of the most psychologically chilling forms of Western punishment. You weren't locked in a cell. You were taken out past the edge of town, sometimes even farther, dragged into the open desert and tied down flat on your back, your arms stretched, your legs spread, ropes pulling at your limbs, and the sun above you felt like it was sitting only a few inches from your face. You can feel the heat prickling your cheeks as you imagine it. You hear the buzz of insects, the faint whistle of wind across sand, the eerie feeling of being so exposed that even the horizon seems to be watching you. Staking someone out wasn't done on a whim. It was often used for people suspected of horse theft or repeated troublemakers who needed to be scared straight. The idea wasn't always to kill you, but to make you fear the land itself. Because as the hours passed, the desert did the punishing. Snakes, scorpions, coyotes who circled just close enough to test your resolve. Your tongue thickened from thirst, your skin blistered, and when the sheriff finally returned, if he returned, you were a different person. Today, the closest thing you've probably experienced is maybe a tough camping trip or a long day in the sun. But imagine being pinned to the ground by strangers, left helpless, and forced to confront every fear you have in absolute silence. How long do you think your mind would have stayed steady? There's another punishment so unsettling that even Western novels often skip it: the death by the rope that wasn't meant to kill. When you see a noose in a Western, you think of hanging as an execution. But in many frontier towns, the rope wasn't always used to kill. You were hoisted up just enough to cut your breath, your toes grazing the dirt, and then dropped back down. Over and over, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. It was called hoisting, and it was designed to break your will, not your neck. You can feel your throat tighten when you picture it. The scratch of the rope, the panic of your body trying hard to breathe, that wild kicking feeling where your legs search for ground that barely exists beneath them. And every time your lungs filled again, the crowd would watch the fear drain from your eyes. They believed it worked because it humbled you. The context was power. A sheriff needed to control chaos quickly, and nothing did that better than making someone face the edge of death without quite crossing into it. Today there are endless debates about humane punishment, civil rights, due process. Back then, due process might have just meant the sheriff gave you one warning before tossing the rope over the branch. Ask yourself honestly, If you were in that crowd, watching someone gasp for air, would you have looked away? Or would you have watched just to make sure they learned their lesson? And then you think about the punishment known as ear cropping, one of the most shocking, though rarely spoken aloud. If someone was a repeat thief or a violent troublemaker, and the town didn't want to kill them but needed everyone to know who they were, they'd slice off part of the ear, usually the top ridge or lobe. The knife was quick, but the pain was sharp enough to leave you breathless. The bleeding didn't stop easily, and afterward, every person who saw you knew exactly what you had done. Today, physical mutilation as punishment is unthinkable in most societies, but for the frontier, it was efficiency. A scar that spoke louder than any record book, and you can't help but wonder, how many misunderstandings or false accusations must have followed a man whose ear was cropped? How many times did people judge him before hearing his story? These memories hit you harder as you go deeper into them, don't they? Because the Wild West you grew up seeing was always dusty, dangerous, sure, but not this raw, not this personal. And as you hear these stories unfold, you feel that quiet shock settle in your chest, because you start to realize just how different justice was when survival mattered more than mercy. You can't talk about brutal Western punishments without remembering the gauntlet. You might have seen versions of this in old movies, but they never show you what it actually felt like. Imagine this. You're forced to walk between two tight rows of men, each one holding something. Belts, sticks, ropes, sometimes just their bare fists, and you have to walk through them, slowly, because they make sure you walk, not run. Every step forward means another strike to your ribs, your back, your shoulders. You can almost hear the thwack of leather slapping against skin, the grunt of a rancher swinging a knotty stick, the sting that explodes across your body before you can even brace for it. In the West, the gauntlet wasn't a punishment meant to kill you, but it was meant to beat the arrogance out of anyone who thought they were untouchable. Rustlers, drifters, brawlers. If you acted too big for your boots, the men of the town would remind you exactly who held the power. Sometimes it wasn't even lawmen enforcing it. Sometimes the sheriff just stepped aside and let the citizens deal with it themselves. Today you'd call that vigilantism, mob justice. Back then, it was called community. People didn't trust formal systems. They trusted the hands they could see. Now, imagine yourself in that corridor of anger, every face scowling, every arm pulled back, waiting for you. Could you take those steps knowing exactly what was coming? Then, there was one of the harshest psychological punishments, posting. Now, the word sounds harmless, almost domestic, but in frontier towns, it meant humiliation carved deep into your memory. If you were caught lying, cheating, or committing minor fraud, they'd take a wooden board and write your offense on it, sometimes with charcoal, sometimes carved with a knife, and hang it around your neck. Then, they'd post you, literally tie you to a post in the middle of town for everyone to see. You can picture the sun baking the top of your head, the rope itching against your wrists, flies landing on your face as you try not to react. People walked past, some laughed, some lectured you. Some pretended not to see you at all, which somehow felt even worse. The idea behind posting wasn't just punishment, it was deterrence. A jail could only hold 1 or 2 people, and even then, it wasn't built for long-term stays. But shame? Shame did the work of 10 sheriffs. Today, public shaming is left to online comment sections or tabloids. But back then, you stood there in full daylight, the entire town judging you with their boots planted firmly in the dirt. And when the rope finally came off, the real punishment began, because everyone knew your face. Would you be able to walk back into a saloon after something like that? Would you ever feel welcome again? And while movies hint at it, they never show you what the whipping post was really like in a frontier town. You hear the word, and maybe you imagine a dramatic scene, rain pouring, lightning flashing, a man tied to a post while a masked villain lashes him. But that's Hollywood. The real whipping post was simpler, smaller, and infinitely more humiliating. Picture a sun-bleached beam, splintered and worn smooth, where countless backs had been forced against it. Your wrists tied high above your head, your shirt torn off, and the crowd, yes, there was always a crowd, standing just far enough away to avoid the flying dust, but close enough to hear the whip crack against skin. The whip wasn't always leather. Sometimes it was braided rawhide. Sometimes it had tiny knots that ripped flesh instead of cutting it. Sometimes they dipped it in water first so it struck heavier. And the sound, it wasn't the sharp snap you hear in movies. It was a wet, heavy thud, a sound that made people wince even when they weren't the ones being hit. Whippings were used for everything from theft to public drunkenness to insulting a town official. In modern courts, you'd get a fine or maybe a suspended sentence. But in the West, your back carried the scars of your mistakes. And you can't help but ask yourself, if that punishment existed today, how many people would think twice before acting out? There was also a chilling punishment that blended pain with absolute vulnerability. Hog tying. You've seen cowboys hog tie calves during rodeos, wrists and ankles bound behind them, body arched awkwardly. Now imagine that being done to a grown man. Once tied, you couldn't move, you couldn't stand, you couldn't protect yourself. They'd leave you like that in the middle of town, on a porch, outside a jailhouse, or even in a dusty street. Hours would pass. Your muscles would cramp until you felt like your bones were grinding together. Your mouth would go dry. You'd hear footsteps walking past, but couldn't turn your head to see who they belonged to. Hog tying wasn't always used for crime. Sometimes it was used for drunks who became violent. Sometimes it was used for outlaws who needed to be transported. Sometimes it was pure humiliation handed down by townsfolk who felt slighted. And the thing about hog tying is, it didn't just hurt, it stripped away every ounce of dignity you had. Compare that to today, where even handcuffs come with policies, protocols, and body cams. On the frontier, you were lucky if the rope wasn't pulled tight enough to dislocate a shoulder. Would you have been able to stay calm, tied like an animal under the open sky, with strangers staring at you as if you weren't quite human? Now think about tar and feathering, something you probably learned about in school but didn't truly understand. The movies never get it right because they make it look like a comedic punishment, some angry mob dumping a bucket of feathers on a troublemaker. But the real version was horrifying. First came the tar, heated to a temperature just below boiling. Too hot and it would kill you outright. Too cool and it wouldn't stick. The perfect temperature to cling to skin but not destroy it, at least not immediately. They'd strip your shirt, hold you steady, or not steady enough, and pour or brush the tar onto your chest, your shoulders, your back. You can almost smell it now. Thick, smoky, sticky, burning. Then came the feathers, sticking to the tar like flies on syrup. The punishment wasn't meant to be lethal, but infections often followed. Burns festered, skin peeled away in sheath, and the humiliation was even worse. You weren't just punished, you were turned into a spectacle. The whole town watched, and afterward, you were marked as someone to avoid. Today, cosmetic injuries lead to lawsuit. Back then, you were lucky if someone brought you water afterward. And as you picture that hot tar being brushed across your skin, you can't help thinking, how much pain could you endure before you begged for mercy? Another punishment that defined the West was the silence cell, also called the coffin cell. These weren't real cells. They were wooden crates just barely large enough for a body. You'd be shoved inside, knees bent, back hunched, head tucked, and the door nailed shut behind you. Darkness swallowed you whole. The air grew stale. The heat pressed in like a blanket made of sand. Hours passed, sometimes a whole day. The silent cell wasn't about physical injury. It was about psychological collapse. You'd listen to your own breathing until it echoed like someone else's. You'd try to stretch but couldn't. And in that cramped box, time stopped being time. It turned into punishment by itself. Frontier towns used silent cells when jails were full or when they needed someone to feel the consequences instantly. Today, solitary confinement is debated constantly. Its ethics, its effects, its limits. But in the West, no one debated anything. They nailed the box shut and walked away. And when they finally opened it, the person who crawled out wasn't the same one who went in. As you imagine being inside that cramped wooden coffin, ask yourself, how long would it take before the panic set in? And then there was public dunking, another punishment that sounds light until you feel it. A person would be tied to a chair or sometimes a makeshift plank and repeatedly dunked into a river, a trough, or a well bucket. Not long enough to drown them, but long enough to make their chest seize, long enough for water to sting their nose and throat, long enough for them to choke and gasp while the crowd laughed. Dunking was used for everything from profanity to petty theft to domestic disputes. The shock of cold water, the fight for air, the sputtering gasps. It was sensory punishment at its rawest. Today, waterboarding is considered torture. Back then, dunking was a community event. If you knew you might face something like that, would you have spoken your mind as freely? And as you sit with these memories, you start to realize how thin the line was between punishment and cruelty. The West wasn't lawless. It had laws, but those laws were stitched together with rope, sweat, fear, and improvisation. And when punishments were handed out, they weren't just about justice, they were about survival, dominance, and making an example loud enough that the next person thought twice. One punishment you rarely hear about, yet it shaped entire reputations on the frontier, was something called the walkaway sentence. It sounds harmless at first, almost gentle, but the reality was stark. Instead of locking you up or tying you down, they'd drag you to the very edge of town, whatever distance marked the invisible border of their tolerance, and force you to walk. No horse, No food, no weapons, just your boots, the clothes on your back, and the hard silence of the open land ahead of you. You picture the gritty wind hitting your face, the way the horizon stretches so wide it feels like it could swallow you whole. They didn't care where you went. They only cared that you left. This punishment wasn't about pain. It was about erasure. You were being pushed out of a place you might have called home, told you didn't belong there anymore. And in the West, being alone out there was almost a death sentence by itself. Coyotes hunted at night. The sun punished during the day. Water was unpredictable. And if you didn't know the land, you were nothing but a slow-moving target. Today, you'd move to another city, start fresh, apply for work, maybe even forget the past. But back then, if a town forced you out, your options were limited. Another town might refuse you. Outlaws might find you. Even nature itself could turn hostile. Ask yourself, could you walk willingly into that kind of uncertainty? Another brutal punishment that movies almost never mention was the dragging. If you crossed the wrong rancher or sheriff, especially if tempers ran high, they'd tie you behind a horse, usually not tightly enough to kill you, but tight enough to injure you and force you to run or stumble as the horse trotted forward. Dirt flew into your eyes, rocks tore at your skin, your chest burned as you tried to keep your balance, and the crowd watched, their expressions a mix of anger, satisfaction, and sometimes even amusement. You think of how movies show the West as a world of rugged honor, but this was revenge dressed up as justice. Drag punishments were used for thieves, swindlers, and anyone who had pushed a town's patience too far. Sometimes they tied your hands in front, sometimes behind. Sometimes they dragged you through town. Sometimes they dragged you until the sheriff's fury cooled. Today, something like this would end in lawsuits, arrests, headlines. Back then, it was considered a warning. And as you picture yourself stumbling behind that horse, dust filling your lungs, you can't help but ask, how many steps would you have taken before collapsing? Now think about the cold cell, not the coffin cell, not solitary confinement. This was different. In colder territories, lawmen used makeshift jails with open slats or missing walls. Winter winds cut through them like knives. Prisoners were forced to sit inside with no fire, no blankets, sometimes not even shoes. You picture yourself sitting on a stone floor, your breath turning into white fog, your fingers numb, your toes losing sensation one by one. And all you can do is sit there, listening to the wind howl through the gap. The cold cell wasn't meant to freeze you to death, but it was meant to humble you, to make you fear the sheriff's authority more than the weather. The context made it effective. Heating was expensive. Wood was precious. Frontier towns weren't going to waste resources keeping a prisoner warm, so the punishment became part of the climate. Today, jails are climate controlled, and even then there are rules, inspections, standards. But in the West, nature itself was the jailer. And as you imagine the cold biting your skin hour after hour, ask yourself, how long before you'd agree to anything just to be let out? You also can't forget a punishment called shunning, which sounds gentle but was one of the deadliest social tools a small town could use. If you violated community norms, not laws, but norms, you could be cut off entirely. No one would sell to you, no one would speak to you, no one would share water, food, or news with you. On the frontier, isolation wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. You relied on your neighbors for everything. If something broke, they helped fix it. If someone got hurt, they helped carry them. If supplies ran low, they shared. Without that support, you were as good as dead. Shunning wasn't loud like tar and feathering. It wasn't violent like the gauntlet. It was quiet, deliberate, and suffocating. You'd walk into the saloon, and the room would go still. You'd approach the general store, and the clerk would stare past you as if you were invisible. You'd knock on a neighbor's door, and no one would answer. Compare that to today, where loneliness is emotional but not fatal. In the West, social exile could be the worst punishment of all. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the entire town has silently agreed you don't deserve to survive. How long could you last without anyone to rely on? Then there was the spitting chair, a punishment rooted deeply in humiliation. A person, usually someone who had offended the town with arrogance, insults, or persistent troublemaking, was tied to a chair in the middle of a saloon or street. People would walk up and spit at them. Some did it angrily, some laughed, some ignored you altogether, which made the humiliation oddly sharper. The point wasn't pain. It was degradation, to make you feel so small, so insignificant, that you'd think twice before crossing the community again. It sounds primitive, even childish, but humiliation was current currency in frontier towns. It kept people in line more effectively than jails or fines. Today, someone might post something rude online, get dragged in comments, and shrug it off. But imagine that dragged-out shame happening face-to-face with the entire town participating. How long before your pride cracked under the weight of their contempt? And there's a punishment even grittier, called the smokehouse. Many frontier towns had small sheds used for storing meats or tools. When someone broke rules, they'd be shoved inside after a fire was lit outside the walls. Smoke filled the cramped interior, stinging their eyes, burning their throat, making every breath a struggle. Not enough to kill, just enough to make the body panic. You imagine your eyes tearing uncontrollably, your lungs fighting for clean air, the walls pressing in on you as if the building itself were punishing you. Time inside the smokehouse felt like an eternity, even if it lasted only minutes. It worked because fear is more powerful than pain. After one smokehouse punishment, a person rarely repeated their offense. Today, something like this would be international news, but back then, it was just Tuesday. Would you hold your breath and stay calm, or would the panic overwhelm you? Then comes the punishment that brings together fear, humiliation, and physical exhaustion, the water haul. If you angered the wrong rancher or sheriff, they'd force you to fill buckets of water from a well and carry them back and forth across the town, sometimes for hours. The buckets weren't light. The sun was unrelenting. You'd feel your shoulders burning, your back tightening, your hands going numb. And anytime you spilled even a drop, they'd make you start over. People watched. Kids laughed. The sheriff stood with his arms crossed, making sure you didn't slow down. The water haul wasn't violent, but it was punishing. It broke your pride. It strained your muscles to their limit. It reminded you that out there, labor was the ultimate currency. And losing control of your own body in front of everyone felt like a punishment deeper than pain. Today, physical labor as punishment is heavily regulated. But in the West, if you were strong enough to cause trouble, you were strong enough to carry water all afternoon. Ask yourself, how long could you carry those buckets before your arms gave out? Another brutal form of discipline was the cattle pen. If someone caused a disturbance, especially when drunk or disorderly, they might be locked inside a cattle enclosure for hours. You'd stand ankle-deep in old hay, mud, and whatever the animals left behind. The smell alone could overwhelm you. Sharp ammonia, sour manure, the heavy musk of cattle. But the worst part wasn't the smell. It was the danger. Cattle are unpredictable, curious, heavy. They'd bump against you, snort in your face, shove you aside, or step on your belongings. You were trapped with animals that didn't care about your suffering, and you could feel your heartbeat pounding as you tried not to provoke them. This punishment wasn't about pain. It was about stripping someone of their pride and throwing them into the gritty reality of frontier life. Today, you'd spend a night in a drunk tank. Back then, you might spend the night smelling like a barn, terrified that every shifting weight in the darkness might crush you. Could you stay calm in a pen full of 1,000-pound animals with nowhere to run? Then there was forced witnessing, a punishment that targeted the conscience. If you broke a rule, especially one involving property damage or violence, the sheriff might force you to stand and watch as the town repaired your mess or tended to the victim you'd harmed. You couldn't help, you couldn't speak, you just watched. The idea wasn't physical pain, it was moral pain, to make you confront the consequences with no escape. Today, restorative justice programs try to handle this with therapy and mediation. Back then, they made you stand in the dirt and watch the people you offended put their world back together. And as you picture yourself standing there, hands tied, heart sinking with every board replaced or wound treated, you can't help but wonder, would the shame of watching someone fix your damage be enough to change you? All these punishments show you something movies never fully capture. The Wild West wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clean, and it wasn't heroic. It was raw, harsh, and deeply human. Justice wasn't about fairness. It was about survival, reputation, and community control. Another punishment the West inflicted was called the town scrub. It wasn't violent in the sense of bruises or broken bones, but it was exhausting, humiliating, and relentless. Picture this: a person accused of theft or laziness is sent to scrub every public building, every porch, every plank of boardwalk in town, from dawn until dusk. The brush in your hands scrapes against rough wood, leaving your fingers raw and bleeding. The smell of soapy water mixes with dust, sweat, and the tang of old animal hides from the nearby stables. Townsfolk would wander past, inspecting your work, whispering judgments. Children sometimes mocked, dogs barked, and no break was allowed. In today's world, community service seems mild, maybe a few hours at a shelter, but back then, it was public penance in the ET. Hot sun, a punishment that marked your endurance and humiliated your pride. You can almost feel your hands blistering now just imagining it. Could you endure that without breaking under the eyes of everyone you knew? Then there was the iron collar, a punishment so rare it survived mostly in whispers. A heavy iron band would be fastened around the neck, shackled to a post or beam, leaving only a few feet of movement. You couldn't kneel, you couldn't lie down, you could barely turn your head. Sun, wind, and insects assaulted you as the hours passed, and the weight of the iron pressed on your shoulders and collarbone until your muscles ached uncontrollably. Contextually, it was for thieves, cheaters, and outlaws who had crossed someone influential in town, people who needed to be reminded how small and powerless they really were. Today, we have ergonomically designed restraint systems for security, but in the West, there was nothing engineered except cruelty and endurance. Ask yourself, how long could you remain standing, bound under a scorching sky before despair set in? Another punishment combined fear, exposure, and the raw unpredictability of frontier life. The pit overnight. Miscreants were lowered or sometimes pushed into a shallow pit just deep enough that climbing out alone was difficult. The soil pressed against your back and legs, rocks dug into your hands, and the cold earth seeped into your bones. They might leave you there for hours or until night fell, exposing you to the chilling desert air or the damp morning dew or even prowling animals. Contextually, this was often reserved for those who had repeatedly challenged the sheriff or upset the town's fragile peace. Unlike the cold cell, where the punishment was static, the pit left you vulnerable to your surroundings and your imagination. Could you lie there alone, heart hammering, listening to every shift of dirt and every whisper of movement, knowing the law and nature were both against you? Then came the punishment designed to attack not your body, but your sense of order, the overturned cart. A misbehaving person would be strapped inside a wagon or cart, which was then tipped onto its side or dragged over uneven ground. You could feel the jagged edges of wood digging into your back and sides, your body jostled and slammed with every uneven bump. Dust coated your mouth, your eyes, and your skin. Sometimes livestock wandered close enough to step over or around you, occasionally bumping against your legs. The context, public humiliation for minor crimes, meant to teach that life in the West wasn't stable or forgiving for those who stepped out of line. Today, a similar consequence might be a fine or a suspension. Back then, it was physical chaos and sensory torment. Could you maintain your composure as you were shaken, scraped, and displayed before everyone? Stockade time was another punishment designed to combine discomfort with the psychological weight of observation. You were forced to sit, stand, or sometimes lie within a wooden cage in the town square, exposed to the elements and to everyone passing by. Hunger, thirst, heat, or cold compounded the physical discomfort, while the constant gaze of neighbors hammered at your mind. The context was simple. If someone disrupted the social order, the easiest way to restore it was to make the offender visible, helpless, and enduring. Unlike modern incarceration, which is isolated and regulated, this punishment made your suffering part of everyone else's daily routine. Ask yourself, could you endure the eyes of your community without breaking, knowing that every judgment, every whisper, every glance was part of the punishment itself? Finally, we arrive at the punishment that blends every aspect of brutality and social consequence: the public labor sentence. If you harmed property, livestock, or reputation, you could be forced to repair it personally, in full view of the people you wronged. You weren't just fixing what you broke, you were physically exhausted, humiliated, and constantly reminded of your failure. Imagine hauling stones, mending fences, digging ditches, or rebuilding structures under the unforgiving sun while everyone watches, occasionally offering advice or jeering. It attacked every sense. Muscles burning, sweat-stinging eyes, dust-filling nostrils, shame pressing like a second skin. The original context: restoration of order, deterrence, and personal accountability. Today, this might be simplified as community service hours. Back then, it was raw, unflinching, and intensely personal. Could you face your own mistakes this way, in full public scrutiny, with no end in sight until the work was complete? And now, as you look back across these punishments, from forced witnessing to public labor, you begin to understand the West wasn't about romantic duels or frontier heroics. It was a world that demanded survival, respect, and accountability, sometimes in forms that would make us flinch today. Punishments were designed not just to inflict pain, but to engrave lessons onto the body, the mind, and the soul. They were brutal, unflinching, and profoundly human. And yet, in hearing these stories, you feel a strange closeness to that time, a connection to the people who endured, and to the townships that survived on the edge of chaos. So the next time you watch a Western, remember this: the dramatized gunfights, the dusty saloons, the heroics, they barely scratch the surface. Real justice in the West left scars that movies will never capture and carried lessons that were felt, smelled, and burned into memory in ways fiction can only hint at. And as you sit with these images, you might wonder, if you had been there, could you have survived the justice of the Wild West? Or would the dust, the rope, the sun, and the watchful eyes have been too much? Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.